All right. Well, Becca, thank you so much for taking time to speak with me today.
Thanks, Seth. I'm really happy to be here and excited to talk about what is going on in the Great Lakes and how we all can protect them.
Awesome. So, you work with the National Wildlife Federation, which is a national organization that has chapters around the country. And you work on a lot of environmental priorities. Clean water is one of them. I'm wondering if you can tell our listeners a little bit about the organization, what some of your current priorities are as they relate to clean water, and maybe kind of an overview of how it works.
Yeah, for sure. So, as you mentioned, National Wildlife Federation is a big national environmental conservation organization that's been around since the 1930s. And really everything we do in partnership with communities, with our affiliates, which are a key part of our structure. They're their own organizations that help make up the backbone of our organization, and with other environmental conservation organizations and other partners. So here in the Great Lakes, we have the Great Lakes Regional Center with a physical office in Ann Arbor, Michigan, but with staff that are really all across the Great Lakes region. We have staff in 5 different Great Lakes states. And, as we learned over the pandemic, more and more of us can work very well remotely. And so we're having a bigger physical presence in many different places. So we have our hub here in Michigan, but more folks in many places because the threats to the Great Lakes are all over the place. Um, but broadly, NWF works on clean water issues for people and for wildlife really all over the country. In some places, like in the West, you have issues of not having enough water, whereas we have a quantity of water here that's sufficient in the Great Lakes, but we need to protect it because there are a lot of big threats that are facing our water for the fisheries that we appreciate and enjoy, and some folks depend on in the area, and for our own drinking water, for people and for wildlife.
Well, thank you so much for the
Yeah.
work that you do. And yeah, what a rich history and a big legacy. And with that, you're bringing a really rich background yourself into this position that you've been in. And so before you came to the NWF, you've done a lot of frontline environmental work. And I'm wondering if you can, tell some stories and bring us kind of up to speed on your background.
Sure. Yeah. Starting at the very beginning, I really lived in Michigan my entire life, other than in a few times in other countries. I've never lived in another state. So a Michigander through and through. And I grew up really close to Lake Michigan in Southwest Michigan. If you put up our map here.
There we
So
go.
right down here. And was able to just really appreciate the natural world. My mom was a teacher and my dad was a writer and a naturalist, so spent a lot of times outdoors. But also had that real keen interest in learning about how people appreciate the environment, or when they don't, what are the problems that come from pollution and things like that. So that took me to school over at University of Michigan in what was then the School of Natural Resources and Environment, is now the SEAS program, where I started a couple of years into school as an intern in an organization called the Ecology Center. And the Ecology Center is an environmental health organization that works at the local level, the state level, and the national level to protect people from toxic chemicals, from climate change, from various environmental threats. So I did a lot of work there for about 20 years. I had a little bit of a time away for graduate school, but came back. And during that time, some of the more recent things that I had started focusing on were protecting kids from lead poisoning. So we know in the wake of the Flint water crisis, that really brought public attention on the intersection between clean water and lead poisoning and children's health and things like that. And water is an incredibly important place for us to think about things like lead, but it's also one of those chemicals, like some of the others I worked on, that it's in so many things that actually we used for a very long time. The paint in a lot of our old homes, it used to be in our gasoline and things like that. So it created this ubiquitous problem that was this brain drain chemical that impacts kids. Um, so we had to work on a lot of different ways of education, of policy solutions at the state level and at the federal level to address lead in all of its sources there. So that's one of the things that I worked on quite a bit. And one of the programs that I was most proud of is our Lead Impacted Families Together program that brought together parents and grandparents and educators that were working with children who had been lead poisoned to share their stories with the media and with policymakers to get better policies on the books and more funding to actually prevent lead poisoning and to provide resources to those children who are lead poisoned. And that happened, we got it going right before the pandemic. So unfortunately, we had to do it all virtually because as soon as it started, everything was shut down. So we couldn't meet in person during the beginning of that program. But that's an example of really working with the folks that are closest to the issue at hand, which led to some work related to PFAS chemicals or per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, which probably some of your listeners have heard about. You know, they're in our drinking water, they contaminate our farmland, they're in the fish that we eat, unfortunately, in inland lakes and in the Great Lakes as well. And they're this slippery set of chemicals that are used in so many different consumer products, everything from, you know, your Teflon pans to your waterproof mascara and consumer products like that to, you know, other things like firefighting foam that was used by the military and airports to put out gasoline fires and things like that. So these chemicals, we learn, are really toxic for people, for wildlife, and they never break down. They've been called the forever chemicals. So we started when I was at Ecology Center, but in partnership with National Wildlife Federation and our colleagues here, we started working with community members from different areas in the state of Michigan who are really heavily impacted by those PFAS chemicals. And we brought them together, again, NWF Ecology Center, where I was at the time, and our partners at Michigan League of Conservation Voters to support those community members to set their priorities for what they would like to see happen in the state of Michigan, under the guidance and leadership of the community members, to actually have them decide what we want to do as a coalition, what's the right step forward, and then to go forward with that work, to get support from funders to be able to actually meet those priorities and things like that, to talk with lawmakers and decision makers and to make really big things happen. And we've had some pretty impressive victories under the leadership of the community members who came together to form the Great Lakes PFAS Action Network. So that's it for me. I've only been with NWF for just a little bit over a year, but that's a nice bridge between the two pieces of work. Since I had already been working with them, I knew it was a great place to work. I really liked the team. I had met them before I started, and I knew that team shared similar values that I did in terms of putting communities first, working in coalition and in partnership with communities and with other smaller organizations, and then making sure that we're thinking about ecosystem health really broadly and that people are a part of that ecosystem as well as wildlife and other creatures.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Yeah, I have a little bit of history with the Ecology Center peripherally. I was a student at U of M and one of my roommates worked there. I guess it would have been like 22 years ago. So I learned more about it, and they've been powerful partners in a lot of projects. Of course, Michigan League of Conservation Voters, amazing organization. And you know, you're talking about some things that are, it's easy to fall into despair thinking about PFAS and forever chemicals and how pervasive they are, and how for a while it was like this sleeping giant, but now people have realized, you know, like you said, they're in all of these products. So you bought a pair of waterproof boots. Well, that company didn't realize they were poisoning this watershed. And so it's something that I know people that I work with have felt really overwhelmed by. what are you noticing on the front lines of this work to sort of face this head on? It sounds like there's both short-term remediation solutions
Mhm.
that people are working on, and then more of this bigger picture, holistic work to stop this cycle.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's exactly right. I mean, to get to your point about being overwhelmed, it's completely understandable because unfortunately, regular folks like us, we have to sort of navigate this environment where, maybe our water isn't safe to drink anymore. What are we buying? Is that safe for me and my family? And we don't necessarily have, chemistry degrees, a PhD in chemistry to do those things. And even if we did, it's not on the label for many of these products that we would purchase. And we don't know necessarily well, now we have some more protections in Michigan for PFAS in our drinking water, but for many folks on public water systems, they didn't know. And still, for many people on well water, they don't know what's in their water. So it can be very overwhelming. And one of the things that we try to do is in hand with the community members, we created for the Great Lakes PFAS Action Network, we created a guide for communities. What do you do when you find out you have contamination in your community? What are the first steps? And then having other folks that have gone through the same thing that understand is incredibly important because for you and me, even if we're not in a heavily impacted community, it can be overwhelming. But just imagine if all of a sudden you find out that your drinking water is really heavily contaminated and you've been, fixing your kids their juice and their formula or things like that with that water. What do you do and who understands that? And what can folks learn from folks who've unfortunately had that experience before? So I think that's an important role that this coalition in particular can play. Um, and what we try to do then, once folks are feeling a little bit better, is again bringing them together with other peers. That unfortunately, there are too many folks in Michigan that have been impacted, and so that they can have a group and a community action group where they can talk about what do they want to do, what are the solutions, what do they need to learn more about, and how can we help that. So part of it is breaking down the problem, but I really think the most important piece is staying connected with folks that get it, right? And it's not just you on your own because so Sandy Winstelt and Tony Spaniola are two original co-founding members on our steering committee and leaders, and they were very alone, and they found each other, and then they were able to, have their communities join up, and then they've built from there. So that connection with other folks makes these big problems. I don't make them any smaller, but they make it easier because there are more folks addressing it at the same time. And then one of the things that organizations like ours can do is then listen to the concerns and the priorities that are lifted up by the community members. Take that information, look at what are the best ideas that we have out there in policies, and how can we create a set of policies, for example, or regulations to actually start addressing these issues. At the same time, letting the community members know that unfortunately the policymaking process can take a very long time and it's going to be full of ups and downs, and we're going to have some victories and we're going to have some setbacks, and sometimes things won't move in a particular legislative session, but we just have to keep pushing on it. And one of the things that I share with folks is I mentioned lead poisoning when I was working on that before. One of our top priorities for over a decade was universal testing of all children in Michigan at ages of 1 and 2 for lead in their blood. And we fought for over a decade for that policy to get passed. And it finally did this session. And it was way overdue, but we're finally there. We're finally going to be testing every kid in Michigan. We're not going to let kids fall through the cracks. So even though the progress can be really slow, it is a huge impact when it does happen. So I keep that in mind. And that's why I've been able to, keep doing this work that can be really hard and really heavy for over 20 years.
Well, thank you for staying with it
Yeah.
and staying proactive. And it sometimes that helps me to sort of boil it down to, okay, I'm overwhelmed. I can be reactive or I can be proactive. And another sort of phrase that's a touchstone for me that I'm hearing in what you're describing is people who are closest to the pain should be closest to the power.
Yeah.
And so recognizing that, you know, we as organizations have some resources to offer people who are most affected by these issues, and that solutions can come directly from those people affected. And to have a number of groups coming together to do community building around people who have experienced PFAS, and then to have those people be resourced by it and to be given agency to to take action, to learn from each other, and then also to touch policy is really good work, you know.
Yeah.
And it can be frustrating. I work in policy too, and it's there are a lot of it takes a lot of patience, I'll say that, but there
Yeah.
are a lot of good people who are still sticking with it, even though it's a frustrating process. And
Yeah.
I find myself inspired by some of the people I work with, particularly doing federal policy advocacy, because you don't know exactly what's going to happen, but you got to just keep trying. And then once in a while, you have a huge breakthrough that impacts lots of people for a long time. And that those breakthroughs, like you described, fantastic mandatory testing for our
Hmm.
children. And that data is what we need in order to create other policies.
Yep.
And so one of the groups that I work with helped leverage for federal funds to do lead pipe replacement and water affordability support. And so, yeah, it's interesting to try to describe the work, because um, some of it is like what I'm hearing you describe is it's an approach that
Hmm.
is not just one angle. You have to take a lot of different angles.
Hmm.
And some people are very good with a certain approach, you know, but it feels like National Wildlife Federation takes a lot of different approaches and works with a lot of different people and a lot of different communities. And you said it right up front, everything that you do is collaborative, and we're in the same boat. I've found that it's unfortunate that sometimes people are doing the same kind of work and not communicating with each other. So if we put a lot of intention around being collaborative, we find people who are doing similar things, and with our powers combined, we can do a lot more.
Yeah.
And sometimes there's redundancy there that's not necessary, so it creates more efficiency. And so with that in mind, you know, your work is far-reaching, and you're connected to a historic organization that is very far-reaching all across Turtle Island. Um, and yet you have to keep showing up every day and doing the work. Can you talk a little bit about some of the deeper inspiration that fuels you,
Mhm.
and some of what some of how you draw inspiration, perhaps from arts and culture or from
Mhm.
nature or other sectors,
Mhm.
to do the work and to keep showing up and to move through some of the more difficult aspects of the work?
Yeah, definitely. Um, I think that's such a great question, and one that unfortunately never doesn't usually get asked. And what are the things that thrive us through the challenging times, and where do we also go to celebrate?
Yeah.
And how do we celebrate our victories and things like that? Because when they do come, they're pretty awesome. I have, like mentioned, having grown up in Southwest Michigan and having a dad who was a naturalist, spent a lot of time in the woods, collecting plants and mushrooms and things like that, and learning about them. Fishing. I grew up on a small inland lake. And so that connection to nature is always one of the most important things. And when I find myself struggling with something, my personal life or at work, going into nature, be that on a hike or getting on my kayak and doing a paddle, close to home here. I live in Ann Arbor, so I hop in and can go on the Huron quite easily. Um, those are places where I can sort of quiet my mind, connect with nature, connect with the plants and animals that are around. The water is incredibly important to me. And it's one of those places. I mean, I feel like maybe that's why I've never lived in another state other than Michigan because we're surrounded by water, fresh water in particular. It's such a healing element for folks, for me at least, to be able to be there and to have that peace and tranquility to sometimes, deal with really hard, heavy issues when you're talking with folks that are struggling to, like you said, with the water affordability, pay their water bills, keep their water on, or their water's contaminated and it's impacting them, or they are subsistence fishers and they can't eat the fish in the river anymore because it's contaminated. Those are big, heavy issues. And they're going to, require complex problem or complex policy solutions in many cases that are going to take some time. So getting into nature, I would say is one of my favorite ways to do that. I appreciate the arts as well. My fiance is in a band, so I love it when the band is like playing in the basement and practicing there. So that's always fun. It's it's small and it's intimate. They're not performing out in the world yet. But that's a fun aspect there. And then I come from a family that has a lot of visual artists. My uncle, my late uncle did ceramic arts, and I have some of his pieces in my home. And the beauty of ceramics is you actually can hold the piece. And, I've lost my Uncle Tom, but I can like put my fingers in the places on the artwork where he's touched it as well. So there's actually that incredible physical connection there. And then I have other cousins that are printmakers and painters and things like that. For myself, another creative outlet is more on the writing side of things. So just being able to journal about whatever I'm thinking about, whatever I'm seeing out there in the world or in nature and things like that. That's an important creative outlet for me. More personal, more intimate, not really going out into the world to put it out there, but important way to express that.
Yeah, beautiful. Yeah, I really resonate with what you're sharing. All of the pieces of it, and there's a comfort to being with pieces of art that our family members have created, especially if we can't be with them physically. I have a lot of that in my home, and then yeah, for me, being a musician, but also growing up in a musical household, just being around people who are playing or rehearsing or just jamming it just helps my nervous system relax.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, great. And that's so cool that your dad was a naturalist. And
Yes.
is it possible to read any of his writing? Was he published or?
He was. So he and I actually did a field guide together on medicinal plants a couple of years ago. So he's 82 now, and so in his retirement, he's doing some field guides and things like that. And now I'm not remembering the press, but same last name as me, Jim Meuninck. If you Google him, a number of things will come up. And then when I was younger, he was doing more filmmaking. So he did like video field guides on edible wild plants and things along medicinal plants, things like that. But he's stopped doing that a while back, and the field guides are fun to do and a little bit less heavy lift than actually putting a film together.
Yeah, that's great. I'll
Yeah.
have to dig in.
Yeah, definitely.
I do have a field guide to medicinal plants in my house. I'll have to check and see if it's your dad.
Oh, I'll get you one. I will get you one of ours.
Thank
Yeah. Yeah.
Wonderful. Yeah, there's always so much more to learn about the plant world
Yeah.
and ways that plants can help us.
Yeah.
I was just learning more about motherwort
Mhm.
from my partner who made motherwort tincture with her mom yesterday, and just that process. This is wonderful. I feel like it would be great for folks to sort of hear in closing, Becca, what's on the horizon right now for NWF and how can people be involved?
Yeah. I mean, there are so many different pieces of work that are critical right now. And we talked a lot about the chemical side of things, but I think we think of other big threats to the Great Lakes and to our way of life, our ecosystems. Climate change is just a huge one that has to be addressed. The fact that, you know, everything from if you're an angler and you care about trout, and the fact that it's really hard for trout in our streams to actually live their natural life cycle because the streams aren't cold enough anymore in Michigan because of climate change, to if you're living in an urban area and you have like these huge rain events and you have more flooding happening, and that's a concern, to, what's happening with our agricultural system, and the seasons are changing, and, you might be losing crops. Like, this is impacting so many different people here in Michigan. And in some ways, like, we're even buffered from some of the really horrific things that are happening with, mudslides and forest fires and things along those lines. But we still have really acute impacts of climate change here. So we're going to continue to work to shut down Line 5. That has been something that NWF has been a leader on, again, working in coalition with many different partner organizations, with the tribes they're primarily and most heavily impacted by Line 5 going through their lands. That's a huge piece. In Michigan, there was some positive action on the renewable energy standard, but there's a lot more to do with community solar and things like that to make sure that communities across the state can actually have access to things like renewable energy, like solar, in the way that they're hoping to take advantage of that. And then thinking about it's the impacts of climate change, again, back on the fisheries. One of the areas that we're building up is really thinking about all of the things that are threats, and all of the potential solutions to protect our Great Lakes fisheries. We had some huge victories this year in protecting the Great Lakes from invasive carp. So the funding going and the green light for the Brannan Road Lock and Dam in Joliet, Illinois, to keep invasive carp out from coming up from Illinois. And then another barrier in Minnesota on the Mississippi to keep them out. But there's more than just carp that we need to be concerned about in terms of invasive species. And we're going to need to do more about things like microplastics in the Great Lakes. We're working with our partners in the Great Lakes Business Network. So a lot of small businesses that care about the Great Lakes and depend on them to be able to start addressing microplastics and turn off the tap. So we're, stopping so much of this use of single-use plastic that breaks down and then contaminates our waterways, our drinking water even, and the fish that live in the Great Lakes too. So those are just a handful of things. There's so many incredible projects that NWF has, and the staff here that I work with, they're top notch. So, I could keep going on, but I don't think we have that much time for me to talk about all of our programs.
That's wonderful. Well, how can people connect with you and learn
Yeah.
more, get involved?
Yeah. People should definitely check out our website. So nwf.org/great-lakes. And they can find us on social media. We have, I think we're on all of the different platforms looking for NWF Great Lakes. Those are great ways to connect. And if you're in Ann Arbor, just give us a call, and we do have an office. So, if folks want to stop by sometime.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, this is really big work that you're doing, and you're doing it so well. And we at Title Track are so grateful for your leadership and your presence here in Michigan. And I think I speak for both of us when I say it's really comforting, and I feel really grateful to be a part of a community of environmental leaders that are working together to face our most serious problems. And you and NWF are right at the center of that. And we appreciate you so much.
Thank you, Seth. Thank you. I really appreciate you and giving this platform to like you said, the amazing leaders in Michigan and the region that are really working to protect people, the planet, wildlife, and everyone.
Awesome. Well, keep up the good work, and we'll see you down the road.
Thank you. Sounds good. Bye.
Bye bye.